Welcome to today's story, Veins of the Apocalypse, brought to life by StoryWave.ai. Don't forget to hit like, share this tale, and subscribe for daily adventures in storytelling. Chapter 1, Calm Before the Storm. The sun, a fierce orb of unyielding light, waged its daily war against the sprawling wilds of Oklahoma, casting elongated shadows that danced at the whim of the leaves. I wiped the sweat from my brow, the fabric of my uniform clinging to my skin like a second layer of duty. The wilderness was my temple, a place where the whispers of the wind and the rustle of the underbrush spoke more to me than any human voice could. "Payton," barked Sergeant Harrows, his voice cutting through the serenity like a knife. "Focus up. These are the skills that keep us alive." My gaze snapped to the task at hand, my fingers deftly assembling the components of my M4 carbine. I was Kent Payton, sergeant in the National Guard, and this was my reality, a constant state of preparation for threats unseen. The training exercise was routine, yet through the methodical clicks and snaps of machinery and man working in unison, an unease settled in my gut. The others felt it too. I could see it in the tight set of their jaws, the quick, darting glances toward the sky. Elena, a lean silhouette against the backdrop of trees, approached with the silent grace of a doe, her nurse's instincts kicking in at the sight of my furrowed brow. "You all right, Kent?" Her voice was the calm in my storm, soothing yet firm. "Just the eclipse making everyone antsy, I guess," I replied, my voice deep and authoritative, trying to convince myself more than her. She chuckled, the sound as welcome as a cool breeze. "Superstitions? From a seasoned guardsman?" "It's not that," I started, pausing to find the words as I looked up at the encroaching darkness of the moon's shadow. It's as if nature itself is holding its breath. We stood side by side, watching as daylight dimmed, plunging the world into an eerie twilight. It was then that I noticed Dr. Victor Hale, the virologist, observing us from a distance, his icy blue eyes reflecting an inscrutable storm of thoughts. His presence was an oddity, a scientist amidst soldiers, and yet he carried himself with a peculiar air of authority. The eclipse reached totality, and for a heartbeat, the world was silent. In that darkness, I felt a primal fear, the kind that whispered of ancient times when man was not the apex predator. When light returned, it brought no comfort, only the stark realization that our training might soon be put to the ultimate test. "That was something, huh?" Elena murmured, her brown eyes wide and searching. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Something we'll remember." As the shadows retreated and the world resumed its symphony of sounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the precipice upon which we stood, the calm before a storm that would test the very essence of our being. Little did I know, as I secured my gear and joined the ranks, that this day of peace was to be our last. The veins of the apocalypse were already threading their way through the fabric of our reality, and soon we would all be engulfed in the battle for survival and humanity. Unaware of the chaos to come, we marched back to base, our formation an indication to the order we were about to lose. The Oklahoma wilds, once a sanctuary of solitude, now echoed with the drumming of impending doom. And I, Kent Payton, would soon find myself navigating a new predatory landscape, where the rules of engagement had changed, and the enemy was no longer one we could see or understand. The storm was coming, and I was woefully unprepared for the darkness it would bring. Chapter 2, Dark Omens. The mess hall buzzed with the low hum of unease, a clear divergence to the usual banter that filled the space. I sat with a tray of food I barely touched, the knot in my stomach growing tighter with every hushed conversation that reached my ears. Harrows leaned in, his voice a gruff whisper. "Kent, you catch wind of the chatter?" I nodded, my gaze locked on the uneaten food. "Hard to miss. Talk of some sickness?" His eyes scanned the room before he continued. "More than just a bug, they're saying. Whole towns acting strange, like their brains got scrambled." Elena joined us, her presence a balm to the tension that clung to the air. I overheard the medics. "It's not just behavior. People are getting violent, attacking each other." The words were like a cold splash of water. "Violent? That's not just some seasonal flu." Harrow's face was grim. "No, it ain't. Command's got us on standby. They think it's a bio-threat." My heart hammered in my chest. A biological threat meant danger on a scale we weren't equipped for, an invisible enemy that could be lurking anywhere. The clatter of the mess hall faded as a commotion at the entrance drew everyone's attention. Dr. Hale strode in, his usual crisp demeanor replaced by an urgency that set my nerves on edge. "Attention," he called out, silencing the room instantly. "We have a situation, a viral outbreak, the likes of which we've never seen. It's aggressive, and it's spreading fast." Murmurs erupted, fear and questions mingling in a noise of concern. Harrows stood, his stature demanding silence. "Doctor, are we at risk?" Hale's icy gaze swept over us. "We're uncertain. For now, the base is secure, but we must remain vigilant. Any sign of illness must be reported immediately." Elena's voice was steady, but I could hear the undercurrent of worry. "What are the symptoms, doctor?" "Cognitive decline, aggression, and a complete breakdown of social behaviors," Hale explained, ticking off each symptom with a raised finger. "It's paramount we maintain order and follow protocols." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. I could feel the shift in the room, the realization that our world was teetering on the edge of something catastrophic. Harrows's voice cut through the tension. "What's our course of action?" "Containment and observation," Hale responded. "We cannot allow this to spread beyond our control." The meeting dissolved into organized chaos as units were assigned tasks and protocols were reiterated. I found myself moving with the flow, my mind racing with the implications of Hale's words. As I prepared for the unknown, securing my gear with a practiced hand, the gravity of our situation settled in my bones. This was no training exercise. This was the real deal, and failure was not an option. The whispers of an unknown virus had turned into roars of a looming threat, and as the Eclipse's shadow waned, a darker omen loomed over us. I was no stranger to adversity, but this was a monster unlike any I had faced before. In the silent moments before we deployed, I made a silent vow. Whatever this threat was, I would meet it head-on. The veins of the apocalypse might be spreading, but I was determined to be the tourniquet that stopped the bleeding. As I stepped out into the fading light, my unit at my back, I knew one thing for certain. The storm had broken, and we were in the eye of it. Chapter 3, Eclipsed by Chaos. As the moon devoured the sun, an eerie stillness cloaked the base. We stood, a band of guardsmen, under the darkened sky, waiting for the celestial performance to end. But nature had a different spectacle in mind. It began with a scream, a piercing, soul-chilling sound that clawed its way through the silence. I turned, hand instinctively reaching for my sidearm, as chaos erupted around us. A man, his uniform torn and stained, staggered into view. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as if every muscle in his body was rebelling against his own will. "Jackson, what in God's name?" Harrows's voice was cut short as the man lunged, teeth bared, eyes wild with a feral hunger that was unmistakably inhuman. Without thinking, I tackled Jackson to the ground, struggling to restrain him. "Get the medics!" I shouted, my voice barely carrying over the raucousness of terror that had begun to unfold. Elena rushed over, her nurse's training taking over as she attempted to sedate the frenzied man. "Kent, hold him steady," she ordered, her calm demeanor a blatant contrast to the madness before us. As I pinned Jackson down, I caught sight of more figures emerging from the shadows, their gait staggered, their expressions devoid of recognition. The virus had taken hold, and the world I knew was dissolving into anarchy. "What's happening?" Elena gasped, her voice tinged with fear as she administered the sedative. "It's the virus," I grunted, feeling Jackson's strength wane under the drug's influence. "It's turning them into monsters." We shared a glance, a silent understanding that this was only the beginning. The base had become a war zone, not against a foreign enemy, but against our own comrades, transformed into creatures of nightmare. "Kent, Elena, we need to move," Harrows yelled, rallying the guardsmen as they formed a defensive perimeter. We fell into formation, moving with purpose, each of us silently battling the shock of our new reality. The air was thick with the scent of fear, the sounds of battle echoing against the walls. As we secured the area, the gravity of our mission settled on my shoulders like a leaden cloak. This was no longer a fight for territory or politics. This was a fight for survival, for humanity itself. Our unit moved through the base, systematically checking each building. The eclipse had passed, but its shadow lingered, a messenger of the darkness that had befallen us. I found myself at the forefront, my rifle a familiar weight in my hands. We entered the mess hall, the scene of our last moment of peace. now a tableau of horror. Bodies lay strewn, some motionless, others writhing with the virus's cruel touch. A creature, once a friend, turned its gaze upon me, its eyes hollow pits of despair. With no time for hesitation, I did what had to be done, my resolve hardening with each pull of the trigger. "Kent, we have to secure the infirmary," Elena called out, her voice cutting through the mayhem. We fought our way to the med bay, encountering pockets of resistance that were once our brothers in arms. Each encounter left a scar on my soul, but I pushed forward, driven by the need to protect, to serve, to survive. The infirmary was a scene of desperate triage, the medics overwhelmed by the influx of victims. Dr. Hale was there, directing efforts with a clinical detachment that bordered on inhuman. "We need to establish a quarantine zone," he instructed, his gaze locking onto mine. "Sergeant Payton, take your squad and secure the perimeter." I nodded, my purpose clear amidst the pandemonium. We were the line between order and oblivion, and I would not let that line break. As the day bled into night, the base transformed into a fortress, a sanctuary against the darkness that sought to consume us. We were the guardians, standing vigilant against the tide of chaos unleashed by the eclipse. The veins of the apocalypse had wrapped around the world, choking the life from it. But as long as breath filled my lungs, I would fight, I would endure, I would overcome. For in this new predatory landscape, I was the hunter, and the monsters would learn to fear my shadow. Chapter 4: The Enemy Unveiled. Dusk bled into the skies over the evacuation center, a once orderly operation now a tableau of desperation and dread. The full scale of the outbreak lay before me, an apocalypse in motion, as the infected swarmed the barricades like waves crashing against a fragile shoreline. "Kent, we've got to get these folks out of here," Harrows shouted over the din of screams and the staccato rhythm of gunfire. His face was set in a mask of resolve, the kind that only soldiers know. I nodded, gripping my rifle with renewed purpose. The evacuation center, a labyrinth of tents and hastily constructed barriers, was teeming with civilians, each face a mirror of panic. Elena, her black hair pulled back in a utilitarian ponytail, was tending to a young girl's wound, her hands steady despite the chaos. "We need a clear path to the buses," she called out, her brown eyes scanning for any sign of the infected breaching our defenses. I made my way to her side, firing controlled bursts at the advancing horde. "Elena, how many more need to get out?" She didn't look up from her work. "Dozens, Kent. We're not leaving without them." A scream pierced the air, and I turned to see a man, his arm grotesquely bitten, blood oozing between the fingers of his clamped hand. The virus was spreading, turning victim into aggressor in the blink of an eye. Harrows and I exchanged a grim look, both understanding the stakes. "Containment's the priority," he said, his voice a gravelly command. "We stop them here." The center became a fortress under siege, the infected clawing at the barriers with mindless ferocity. We fought back to back, bullets flying, each fallen infected a small victory in a war that felt unwinnable. Amidst the fray, whispers of a darker truth began to circulate, murmurs of a global cabal that had unleashed this horror upon the world. I shook them off, focusing on the here and now, the lives that hung in the balance. "Kent, we've got a breach." The shout came from Jackson, who had recovered enough to rejoin the fray. His eyes, once wild with the virus, now showed only the fierce determination of a soldier. I rushed to the breach, my boots slipping in the viscous mix of mud and blood. The infected poured through like a dam burst, their moans a chilling chorus to the night's grim symphony. With each pull of the trigger, I fought back the darkness, the faces of the infected blurring into a singular nightmare. There was no room for hesitation, no space for mercy. This was survival, pure and simple. As the last of the civilians boarded the buses, the engines roared to life, a hopeful growl amidst the bustle of despair. We provided cover, our bullets carving a path of salvation through the horde. The buses pulled away, and for a moment there was a breath of respite. But the enemy was unveiled, and its face was one of endless hunger, a hunger for flesh, for life, for the world we knew. We regrouped, the evacuation center now a graveyard of the fallen. Harrows's face was etched with the cost of our victory. "We hold the line," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "We keep fighting." The night grew darker, the stars obscured by the smoke of burning barricades, and in that darkness the enemy lurked, unveiled and unrelenting. But as I stood with my unit, the smell of spent gunpowder in the air, I knew that this was but one battle in a war that was only just beginning. The whispers of conspiracy, the outbreak's relentless spread, these were the monsters we would overcome. For I was Kent, and I would not falter. The veins of the apocalypse might have been exposed, but I would be the force that stopped their insidious spread, no matter what horrors lay ahead. Chapter 5: The Fall of Communication. Silence fell like a shroud over the communications room, the static of the radio now a distant memory. I stood among the tangled wires and dead screens, the lifeline to commands severed as if by an unseen hand. A cold realization settled in my gut. We were on our own. Harrows slammed a fist against the console. All channels are dead. It's like we've been wiped off the map. The room was filled with the low murmur of my unit. Men and women trained for combat, but not for the stillness that now hung over us like a specter. I glanced over at Elena, who was rummaging through the backup equipment, her hands a blur of motion as she sought some semblance of a signal. "Anything?" I asked, my voice cutting through the tension. She shook her head, her usually soothing tone laced with frustration. "Nothing, Kent. It's as if the world's gone quiet." The silence was oppressive, a tangible force that amplified the distant groans and snarls of the infected just beyond the barricade. With each passing moment, the sense of isolation grew, wrapping around us like the creeping vines of dread. Jackson, his face smeared with grime and sweat, approached with a handheld radio. "I've been trying to reach anyone, but it's like shouting into the void." Harrows ran a hand through his hair, the lines on his face deepening with concern. "We can't stay blind. We need eyes on the situation." I nodded, the weight of leadership pressing down on me. "We'll send out recon teams. If we can't talk to command, we'll get the lay of the land ourselves." The plan was met with nods of agreement, a collective need to act rather than wait in the heavy silence. Teams were formed, each tasked with scouting the surrounding area and reporting back any signs of other survivors or the scope of the outbreak. As my team prepared to move out, Elena pulled me aside. "Kent, be careful. Without comms, we can't warn you if," I placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll be cautious. Keep trying to get a signal. We need any advantage we can get." The air outside was thick with the scent of decay, the once familiar streets now a foreign landscape marked with the carnage of the outbreak. We moved silently, hand signals our only means of communication as we navigated the urban jungle. Our path took us past an electronics store, its windows shattered, the display TVs flickering with static. It was a grim reminder of our cut-off state, the technology that had connected us now as lifeless as the bodies that littered the ground. We pressed on, the absence of human voices making the city feel like a tomb. The infected were everywhere, their presence a constant threat that kept us on edge, our fingers never straying far from our triggers. At the edge of a park, we encountered a group of survivors, their faces etched with the trauma of the world turned upside down. Their leader, a burly man with a makeshift bandage wrapped around his arm, stepped forward. "Y'all with the military?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. I nodded. "National Guard. We're trying to assess the situation." The man's eyes held a flicker of hope. "We've been holed up here since the outbreak. Any word on safe zones?" I shook my head, the gesture feeling like a betrayal of their hope. "Comms are down. We're as in the dark as you are." The conversation was cut short by a guttural roar, an infected charging from the tree line. The team reacted with practiced precision, taking down the threat before it could reach the survivors. The man's gratitude was palpable, his hand extended in a rough shake. "Name's Marcus. If y'all find a safe place, come back for us." "We will," I promised, the words a vow I intended to keep. The return to base was a somber march, the recon teams reporting similar findings: destruction, death, and silence. The enemy had been unveiled, and its face was one of relentless devastation. As night fell, the base stood as a lonely beamer in a world gone silent. The fall of communication had isolated us, but it had also prepared our resolve. We were stranded without orders, facing an aggressive enemy, but we were not defeated. In the darkness, whispers of conspiracy took root, the idea that this virus was no accident but a weapon wielded by unseen hands. The rumors spoke of a global cabal, a shadowy group with apocalyptic ambitions. But as I lay in my bunk, the sounds of my unit's restless movements a reminder of our shared plight, I knew that speculation would not save us. Only action, unity, and the will to survive would see us through. The enemy was not just the infected. It was fear, it was despair, it was the unknown. And I, Kent, would face them all, for the veins of the apocalypse would not claim us without a fight. Chapter 6. Isolation. Gone were the days when the open road was a symbol of freedom. Now, it was a gauntlet we had to run, each mile fraught with peril. Our convoy, 2 battered trucks and a van, rumbled through the desolate landscape of a world turned inside out. Kent, you think we'll find a place untouched by all this? Marcus's voice cut through the rumble of the engine, tinged with a hope that seemed out of place in the apocalyptic tableau that unfolded beyond the cracked windshield. I kept my eyes on the road, the grip on the steering wheel firm. We have to believe there's something, or we've already lost. Alina sat beside me, her gaze on the side mirror, watching for the telltale signs of pursuit. The hordes were a constant threat, their relentless hunger driving them ever forward, but it was the living we feared just as much. Desperation had turned neighbor against neighbor, stranger against stranger. Keep an eye out for supplies. We're running low on everything, I reminded the group, my voice steady despite the uncertainty that plagued us all. The trucks ground to a halt as we approached what had once been a sleepy town, now a graveyard of civilization. We disembarked, our movements practiced, each of us alert for the slightest sound, the faintest movement. Harrow's motioned to a grocery store, its windows dark, the entrance barricaded with shopping carts. We'll find what we need in there. As we made our way inside, the eerie silence was a sharp distinction to the chaos we had left behind. The shelves were mostly bare, but we scavenged what we could, the sound of cans clinking into our bags a grim percussion. Suddenly, a crash echoed from the back of the store. We froze, weapons drawn, as a figure emerged from the shadows, another survivor, his eyes wild with fear. "Please, don't shoot," he pleaded, his hands raised. His accent was thick, his words colored by a drawl that spoke of southern roots long buried. "We're not here to harm anyone," Elena assured him, her voice a soothing balm. "We're just looking for supplies." The man relaxed slightly, lowering his hands. "Name's Jonah. Been hiding out here since the outbreak." We exchanged wary glances, knowing trust was a luxury we could ill afford. Still, there was strength in numbers, and Jonah's knowledge of the area could be invaluable. "Know of any safe places around here?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Jonah scratched his beard, a nervous tick. "There's talk of a haven up north, a military zone. Could be just a rumor, though. Rumors were all we had, and even those were a precious commodity. We decided to take Jonah with us, his presence a reminder that we weren't the only ones clinging to survival. As we left the store, the sky darkened, an unnatural fog rolling in, obscuring our vision. The first groan reached our ears, an omen of the horde that descended upon us like a tidal wave. We fought back to back, the sounds of our gunfire lost in the furor of snarls and screams. Each fallen foe was an evidence to our will to live, but with every round spent, our situation grew more dire. In the chaos, a new threat emerged: bandits, their morals eroded by the world's end. They bore down on us, their intentions clear in the glint of their weapons and the greed in their eyes. Harrows took a stand, his voice a rallying cry. "We hold them off. Protect what's ours." The clash was brutal, the distinction between human and monster blurred by the violence we were forced to enact. When the dust settled, we were battered but alive, the bandits either dispatched or driven off. We regrouped, our convoy worse for wear but still mobile. As we drove on, the weight of our isolation pressed down upon us. The world was full of monsters, both the ones we could see and the ones that lurked in the hearts of the desperate. But as the leader of this ragtag group of survivors, I held on to a sliver of hope. I would overcome the beasts that stood in our way, for in this new, predatory world, it was the only way to forge a path to safety. The road stretched out before us, a ribbon of uncertainty in a land eclipsed by chaos. Yet we drove on, our small band united against the darkness, searching for a haven in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. Chapter 7. Skirmish at the barricade. The sun hung low, a blood-orange sentinel in the sky, casting long shadows over the remnants of a once bustling intersection now repurposed as our makeshift fortress. Concrete and metal intertwined in a desperate mosaic of defense, The barricade stood as an instrument to our resolve. But as the dark crept in, so did the groans of the infected, a macabre chorus heralding another night of battle. Harrows, with his hands wrapped in the frayed remains of a t-shirt, heaved another sandbag onto the pile. "We'll hold them," he said, his voice raspy from days of shouting commands and lack of sleep. I nodded, though the unease coiled in my gut like a spring. "Keep the flares ready. We'll need every ounce of light once night falls." The group moved with a mechanical efficiency, each person playing their part in the dance of survival. Elena was checking the medical supplies, her movements precise, every bandage and bottle of antiseptic accounted for. Marcus and Jonah, the latter now one of us in solidarity if not in time, reinforced the weakest points, their silhouettes etched against the dying light. "We've got movement on the east side." Jackson's shout cut through the muted conversations, his figure tense atop an abandoned car that served as a lookout post. The horde was upon us faster than we could brace. The infected, a writhing mass of former humanity, crashed against the barricade with the force of a tidal wave. I fired into the advancing swarm, the recoil of my rifle a familiar punch against my shoulder. "Fall back! Regroup!" I yelled, but my voice was swallowed by the racket of snarls and the cracking of wood and metal. Elena was beside me, her own weapon a steady extension of her will. "Kent, we can't hold this position." I knew she was right, but the admission was a bitter pill. The barricade, our symbol of defiance, was crumbling under the relentless assault. "They're breaking through." Marcus hollered, swinging the butt of his rifle with a ferocity born of fear and adrenaline. Harrows appeared at my side, his eyes grim. "We need to retreat, set up a secondary line." I took a deep breath, and the decision was made. "Pull back! Keep them off our heels!" The retreat was a racket of desperate shouts and gunfire. Each step back was hard-fought, the infected surging forward with an insatiable hunger that seemed to mock our efforts. Once we reached a safer distance, the reality of our defeat settled over the group, like ash from a burned-out fire. The barricade, once our stronghold, was now overrun, a stark reminder of our precarious existence. In the flickering light of the flares, doubt was cast upon my decisions. "We put everything into that barricade," Jonah said, his voice tinged with accusation. "And for what? To run?" His words stung, the sting of truth laced with the venom of fear. "We're still breathing, Jonah," I countered, my tone even but firm. That barricade was a statement, not the endgame. Harrows stepped in, his presence a bulwark against the rising tide of dissent. "Kent's right. We're alive, and that's a victory in itself." Elena remained silent, her eyes scanning the darkness for more threats, but I could see the questions in her gaze. Had I led us into a trap? Were my strategies sound, or just the flailing attempts of a man out of his depth? The night wore on. The group huddled behind our new, hastily assembled line of defense. We were bruised but not broken, the flicker of hope still burning despite the onslaught we'd faced. As dawn broke, the horde retreated, their nocturnal fervor abating with the light. We were battered, our morale teetering, but we were not defeated. The initial confrontation with the monster of our new reality had been met with blood and fear, but also with courage. The veins of the apocalypse might have pulsed with victory this night, but I knew our war was far from over. I would learn from this skirmish, adapt our tactics, and ensure that when we built our next barricade, it would be stronger, more perseverant. For in this world eclipsed by chaos, the only path to victory was through perseverance, and I was not one to shy away from the challenge. The fight for survival was our crucible, and I would lead us through it, one battle at a time. Chapter 8, Lost Ground. The chill of dawn did little to lift the weight from my shoulders as I surveyed our dwindling supplies. The cans and packages, once a bounty, now seemed as meager as the hope that clung to our weary band. We had been on the move for days, each sunrise bringing more challenges, each sunset marking the close of another day's struggle for survival. Marcus approached, his face drawn in the pale morning light. "Kent, we've got to talk about the food situation." I nodded, knowing full well the gravity of our circumstance. "I'm aware. We're running on fumes." Elena joined us, her usually steady hands fidgeting with the hem of her sleeve. "It's not just the food," she said, her voice steady despite the concern in her eyes. "It's the medicine, too. We're almost out of antibiotics. The reality of our plight settled in the pit of my stomach like a stone. We'll have to make some hard choices, I admitted, the leader in me bracing for the decisions ahead. It was then that a cough echoed from one of the trucks, a harsh, wet sound that set every nerve on edge. We turned to see Jonah emerging, his face pale, sweat beading on his brow. "Jonah, you okay?" I asked, although the dread in my gut already knew the answer. He shook his head, a hand clutching at his chest. I don't feel so hot, Kent." Harrows, his brow furrowed, stepped closer. "How long you been feeling like this?" Jonah's cough racked his body again. "Since last night. Thought it was just the cold, but..." The implication hung in the air, thick and undeniable. An infection could be a death sentence, not just for Jonah, but for all of us. The group gathered, drawn by the commotion, their faces a canvas of fear and fatigue. The conversation that followed was charged, a clash of desperation and humanity. "We can't risk it," Jackson said, his hand hovering near his weapon. "If he turns, he's one of us." Elena shot back, her voice fierce. "We don't abandon our own." The debate grew heated, voices overlapping in a commotion of anger and fear. Each member of our band weighed in, the tension of our dire state fueling the fire of discord. Marcus, his voice a low rumble, cut through the noise. "We're talking about a man's life here. We can't just cast him aside." "But what about our lives?" Harrows countered. "We've seen what this virus does. We can't take that chance." The words hung heavy, a sentence yet to be passed. I watched Jonah, his body racked with shivers, his eyes pleading for a shred of mercy. In the end, the decision fell to me. As leader, it was my burden to bear, the weight of their lives balanced against the risk of one. "We'll make camp here," I said, my voice carrying the weight of command. "Set up quarantine for Jonah. We'll monitor him, give him a fighting chance." The group's response was a mix of relief and apprehension, the decision made but the conflict far from resolved. We fortified our position, a ring of vehicles and makeshift barriers, our only shield against the encroaching threat. As the day wore on, the air grew thick with the tension of our lost ground. Jonah's condition worsened, his cough a constant reminder of the knife edge upon which we balanced. Night fell, and with it the inevitable outcome. Jonah's transformation was swift, the virus claiming him fully. The confrontation was upon us, the monster of our reality baring its teeth. I stood before Jonah, now a snarling shadow of the man he once was. With a heavy heart, I did what had to be done. The gunshot was a punctuation, an end to the debate, a period at the close of Jonah's story. The silence that followed was a mournful echo of our fractured unity. We had survived the day, but at what cost? The monster we fought was not just the infected, it was the decisions that chipped away at our humanity, the hard choices that tested our resolve. We had lost ground, both in territory and spirit, but we would press on. For in the veins of the apocalypse, survival was not just about living through the night, but about finding a way to live with the dawn. Chapter 9. A Glint of Hope. Harrows, his eyes scanning the debris of what was once a bustling town center, called out, his voice cracking the silence that had fallen over our ragged band. "Kent, you'll want to see this." I approached, my boots crunching over the remnants of a world that seemed increasingly like a distant memory. In his outstretched hand lay a tattered map, its edges worn, but the promise it held was as clear as the dawn that would follow our night. "Found it on one of them. You know, before," he explained, his reference to the infected clear without the need for elaboration. I unfolded the map, the paper feeling like a fragile relic in my hands. A red circle marked a location, no more than a day's journey on foot, with the scrawled words "Research Facility" underlined twice in desperate haste. Elena leaned over my shoulder, her breath warm against my ear as she read the words aloud. Could it be a chance at a cure? The murmurs of our group swelled into a crescendo of cautious optimism. Marcus, his face etched with the lines of too many battles, looked up with a spark in his eyes I hadn't seen since the outbreak began. A cure would mean, it'd mean everything. The gravity of the decision anchored me to the spot. The map was a lantern, a glint of hope in the unending night, but it was also a siren's call, luring us toward potential salvation or certain doom. "What do you reckon, Kent?" Harrows asked, his gaze steady. "Is it worth the gamble?" I weighed the odds, turning the map over in my hands as if the answers were inscribed on the back. To stay meant a slow suffocation, our supplies dwindling, our defenses constantly tested by the horrors that stalked us. But to go was to venture into the unknown, to face untold dangers with only the faintest whisper of hope to guide us. The decision hung heavy in the air, a pendulum poised to swing. "We've been in the dark for too long," I finally said, my voice resolute. "If there's even a chance at turning the tide, we have to take it." The group's response was a mixture of perseverance and trepidation, the fire of hope, a precarious flame against the encroaching darkness. "We'll need to move fast, travel light," I continued, already plotting our course in my mind. "We leave at first light. Tonight, we rest, we plan, and we ready ourselves for what lies ahead." Elena's hand found mine, a silent show of support that needed no words. Marcus and Harrows began discussing logistics, their conversation a low hum that buzzed with the energy of purpose reignited. As the stars claimed the sky, their light a faint echo of the world that once was, I allowed myself a moment to believe in the possibility of a future, a world reborn from the ashes of the apocalypse. The veins of the apocalypse had spread their infection far and wide, but with this map, this glint of hope, we had a path to redemption. We would face the monster that had ravaged our land, our friends and our families, and we would do so with the courage of those who have nothing left to lose. The night passed with whispered conversations and hushed preparations, the air charged with the tension of anticipation. When dawn broke, casting its gentle light upon the battered remnants of humanity, we would set forth, a band united by the slimmest chance at a cure, at sanctuary, at life. And I, Kent, with the map as my guide, would lead us through the fray. Chapter 10. Descent into Darkness. The once vibrant blush of twilight now bled away, leaving behind a blanket of darkness that seemed to swallow the land whole. Our group, a convoy of weary souls, tread softly through the abandoned streets, the silence around us more foreboding than any pandemonium of chaos we'd faced before. Shadows clung to the crumbling facades of buildings like specters, and the moon, a sliver of itself, provided scant illumination. The night was pierced by a sudden, chilling howl that set every nerve on edge, a sound both alien and terrifyingly familiar. Elena, her rifle tight in her grasp, leaned in close. "Did you hear that, Kent? That wasn't like the others." Marcus, his silhouette bulky and tense against the scant moonlight, nodded in agreement. "That's new. It's like it was communicating." Harrows came up beside me, his eyes scanning the dark. "Whatever it is, it's watching us. We need to keep moving, find shelter." We pushed forward, the decrepit buildings around us standing as silent witnesses to our plight. Every shadow seemed to move, every alleyway a potential ambush. The tension was a tangible thing, wrapping around us, constricting tighter with each step. Then it emerged, a figure, unmistakably human once, but now something else. Its movements were deliberate, its gaze unnerving in its focus. This was no mindless drone like the ones we'd become accustomed to. There was an eerie intelligence in its eyes. "Kent, what do we do?" Elena's voice was steady, but the undercurrent of fear was impossible to miss. I kept my rifle trained on the figure, my mind racing. "We don't know what it's capable of. Be ready for anything." The creature stopped a mere 10 paces from us, its head tilting as if considering us. Then, to our collective horror, it spoke, or at least the grotesque mimicry of speech. "Flesh, life, join, us." The words, fragmented as they were, sent a shiver down my spine. This was new, a twist in the nightmare that none of us were prepared for. Harrows stepped forward, his own weapon raised. "That's impossible. They can't think, they can't talk." Yet the evidence was before us, undeniable and terrifying. The creature took another step, its movements eerily human. "Come." Darkness. We stood our ground, the standoff a battle of wills as much as weapons. The creature cocked its head, and behind it, more shadows moved, more of the infected drawn by the presence of their sentient kin. "Kent, orders?" Marcus's voice was a low growl, his readiness palpable in the darkness. "We can't let them surround us," I said, my voice low and calm despite the pounding of my heart. Elena chimed in. "If there's one that can think, there could be more." "We need to get out of here now." The decision was made. "Fall back to the church," I commanded, remembering the sturdy structure we had passed earlier. "We'll make our stand there." As we retreated, the creature and its horde followed, a macabre parade that stalked our every step. The church loomed ahead, its steeple a dark silhouette against the night sky. We barricaded the doors, the pews becoming our ramparts as we prepared for the siege. The infected slammed against the doors, their moans a relentless dirge. But it was the sentient one that held our rapt attention, its gaze seeming to penetrate the very walls that separated us. "We need to know how many of them there are like this," I said, my mind racing with the implications. Elena was already peering through a gap in the barricade. "I can see them, Kent. They're waiting, like they're planning something." The revelation was a cold splash of dread. If the infected were evolving, becoming something more, then the fight for survival had changed. The monster we thought we understood was no longer just a beast of hunger. It was becoming a hunter, and we were its prey. Through the night, we held our breath, listening to the unsettling silence that had fallen over the horde outside. The descent into darkness was complete, and as the first light of dawn crept through the stained glass windows, it revealed the true horror of our situation. We had survived the night, but the battle was far from over. The infected, now with a leader that could think, that could strategize, were a horror beyond comprehension. And I, Kent, had to find a way to overcome this new, intelligent monster, or the veins of the apocalypse would be the end of us all. Chapter 11, Alliance. Elena, with her confident stance and watchful brown eyes, stepped forward. "Kent," she began, her tone both stern and diplomatic, "we've watched you and your people. You're organized, disciplined, but we've got our own way of doing things." I met her gaze, the unspoken tension between us as palpable as the morning mist. "I know. We've seen you in action, too. Resourceful, I'll give you that." Harrows, his arms crossed over his broad chest, interjected with a skeptical eye. "How do we know we can trust you? Last group we tangled with nearly cost us everything." A man from Elena's group, tall and lean with scars that told of close encounters with the infected, stepped up beside her. "Same could be said about you folks," he said, his voice gruff with the dust of the road. "But the way things are, we're better off together than apart." Marcus nodded, the morning light catching on his own weathered features. "We've got a common enemy. It's not each other, it's those things out there." I took a deep breath, aware of every pair of eyes locked onto me, waiting for the words that would either bridge us or divide us further. "We're heading to the research facility," I disclosed, laying our objective on the table. "Supposed to be a safe zone, maybe a cure." Elena's eyes narrowed, a flicker of interest. Chapter 11, Alliance. Elena, with her confident stance and watchful brown eyes, stepped forward. "Kent," she began, her tone both stern and diplomatic, "we've watched you and your people. You're organized, disciplined, but we've got our own way of doing things." I met her gaze, the unspoken tension between us as palpable as the morning mist. "I know. We've seen you in action, too. Resourceful, I'll give you that." Harrows, his arms crossed over his broad chest, interjected with a skeptical eye. "How do we know we can trust you? Last group we tangled with nearly cost us everything." A man from Elena's group, tall and lean with scars that told of close encounters with the infected, stepped up beside her. "Same could be said about you folks," he said, his voice gruff with the dust of the road. "But the way things are, we're better off together than apart." Marcus nodded, the morning light catching on his own weathered features. "We've got a common enemy. It's not each other, it's those things out there." I took a deep breath, aware of every pair of eyes locked onto me, waiting for the words that would either bridge us or divide us further. "We're heading to the research facility," I disclosed, laying our objective on the table. "Supposed to be a safe zone, maybe a cure." Elena's eyes narrowed, a flicker of interest betraying her composed exterior. "A cure, huh? We had rumors, but nothing solid." "Let's cut to the chase," I said, my voice firm. "We join forces, get to that facility, and see this thing through, or we part ways here and hope for the best." The assembly fell into contemplative silence, each person lost in their own calculations of risk versus reward. It was Elena who broke the stillness. "All right, Kent, alliance it is, but we do this together. No one gets left behind." "Agreed," I replied. The decision setting in motion, a fragile pact between strangers in a world that no longer catered to the niceties of society. The sun climbed higher, its warmth a blatant contrast to the cool assessment we made of each other's capabilities. Elena's group had medics, scavengers, fighters, all roles that complemented our own skill sets. Chapter 12, Arsenal of the Apocalypse. Dawn's light hadn't yet pierced the horizon, but we were already on the move, the chill of the early morning air a subtle enemy against our skin. The outpost stood in the distance, a hulking silhouette against the pre-dawn gray, its chain-link fences and sandbagged walls whispering tales of the world before chaos reigned. Elena, with her raven hair pulled back into a no-nonsense ponytail, surveyed the perimeter through binoculars. "Looks quiet, but that doesn't mean it's not crawling with them inside," she murmured, her words hanging in the cool air. Marcus, his hands calloused and his face a map of recent scars, nodded in agreement. "Quiet's good. Means we might be able to get in and out without stirring up a hornet's nest." I clutched my rifle, the familiar weight a reassurance in these uncertain times. "We'll split into teams. One for weapons, one for ammo, and one for anything else we can use. In and out, no heroics." Harrows, his stature like an immovable rock, cracked his knuckles. "You heard the man. Stick to the plan and we all get out of here with a fighting chance." The outpost, upon closer inspection, bore the scars of conflict. Bullet holes pockmarked the walls, and spent casings littered the ground like brass confetti. We slipped inside, our movements as silent as the grave, every sense attuned to the slightest sound, the faintest movement. Elena's team moved toward the armory, their steps measured and cautious. Marcus and I headed for the munitions depot, the air growing staler with each step we took deeper into the belly of the military beast. The depot was a treasure trove of ordnance, shelves lined with boxes of ammunition, grenades, and other instruments of destruction. Marcus let out a low whistle. "We hit the jackpot, Kent." I nodded, my eyes scanning for any sign of the infected. "Let's load up and get out before we overstay our welcome." As we filled our packs with the precious cargo, a distant sound reached our ears, the unmistakable shuffle of the undead. "Time to go," I whispered, and we retraced our steps, our exit as calculated as our entrance. We regrouped outside, the sky now tinged with the first blush of morning. Elena's team had been successful, a cache of rifles and pistols now added to our arsenal, but our victory was short-lived as the sound of the horde grew louder, more insistent. "They're coming," Harrows said, his voice low. "Looks like we weren't as quiet as we thought." The outpost, once a bastion of military might, now felt like a trap closing in around us. The infected emerged from the shadows, their eyes hollow, their thirst for flesh undiminished by the passing of time. "We hold them off as long as we can, then fall back to the rendezvous point," I commanded, the familiar role of leader settling upon me like a cloak. The horde descended upon us, a wave of decay and death. We fought back with the ferocity of those with everything to lose. Bullets tore through the morning air, finding their targets with lethal precision. But for every fallen foe, more took their place, a relentless tide of once human creatures bent on our destruction. "Fall back!" I yelled, the sound of my voice barely rising above the clatter of battle. We retreated, the outpost receding into the distance as we made our escape. The horde followed, but we were armed, we were resolute, and we would not be taken so easily. As we put distance between ourselves and the outpost, the sounds of pursuit began to fade. We had won this battle, but the war against the apocalypse was far from over. We had our arsenal, our will, and our alliance, and as we journeyed toward the research facility, toward the glimmer of hope that it represented, I knew that we were preparing for the final confrontation. The monster would be met with force, with cunning, and with a band of survivors who had been forged in the fires of the end of the world. The curtain falls on our current tale. Gratitude for being part of Veins of the Apocalypse. Trust in StoryWave AI to transform your creative prompts into compelling stories. Show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Daily stories await to whisk you away. March 2024. Goodbye for now.